Good evening. How are you? It's great to be with you on a Sunday night and learning. I suppose the rest of the world is watching the Super Bowl. My Giants aren't in it. I can't be that excited. But hopefully it will be a good game, and I think we'll even finish in time to catch the end of the game. So let's light up the darkness. All right, who's with us on Super Bowl Sunday? Steven, and I'm glad you're here. In Dover, New Hampshire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck, Tom in PA, Shandor in the Bronx. Tom has the game on with the sound off. Belle in Texas, happily ignoring the game. And Debbie in New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. And tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our own Steven Giger. In honor of the AT community. And it's great to be part of a community that learns together. Stephen, thank you for your dedication and your donation. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings beyond even what your ample imagination could conceive. And we say amen. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of AT Daily, donate.accidentaltalmudist.com. And Nina will put the link in the comments. Today we're finishing chapter 3 here in Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Nazirus, as I've repeated every day since we began. I suppose I won't give the general summation right now. But these are the laws of one who takes a vow, which is an unnecessary, an optional vow, to become a Nazir and abstain from the grape product, from all products of the grapevine, and from cutting one's hair, and from becoming impure for the dead, and to bring the offerings of a Nazir upon the completion of that term. Lots of laws are involved, but as we've seen, the general attitude of the sages is to discourage one from taking such an unnecessary vow to make something which is permitted, one, into something that is prohibited. Okay, so let's get into it. Excuse me. All right. We are picking this up with the Gemara of Mishna number 3 of chapter 3. The Mishnah we read yesterday, recall that if one made this vow of Nazirus while in a nation, a land outside of Israel, and by the way, we don't take this vow at all anymore because to complete one's term of Nazirus requires bringing certain offerings, and you can only bring offerings when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, and it hasn't stood for nearly 2,000 years. So even if the temple were standing, it would be discouraged. Now that the temple is not standing, this is impossible, and don't take such a vow. Okay, so Mishnah number 3 said, one who is standing outside of the land of Israel, when he becomes a Nazir, whatever his term of Nazirus is, let's say he completes it, and now he's going to bring his offerings to the temple. So he travels to Israel, to Jerusalem, to bring the offerings. And then he finds out that his Nazirus that he observed while standing outside the land doesn't count for him. Beis Shammai, right, the academy, the followers of the great sage Shammai, would say that he now owes a 30-day term of Nazirus, the minimum term of Nazirus, that to be observed in the land of Israel. And Beis Hillel, whom the law almost always follows, and who is and whose followers, the school, right, the school of Hillel, is almost always putting forward a more lenient opinion than Beis Shammai. But in this case, Beis Hillel is more stringent, and this is the law that even if you observed, as we saw yesterday in the example in the Mishnah of Queen Helena, that she observed a 7-year term of Nazirus outside the land of Israel. Then she came to bring her offerings and learned that the law, according to Beis Hillel, is that the entire term of Nazirus must be observed while inside the land of Israel. And so she had to repeat that entire 7-year term. And then there's a debate in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis of whether she actually became impure near the end of that 7-year term and had to repeat it again, right? If you become impure by a corpse, you step into a cemetery, you become, touch a dead person, helping a burial or a mortician, whatever, now you have to repeat your whole term of Nazirus. So even though it was now observed properly in Israel, it had to be observed again because she became impure. And so the rabbis say she observed 21 years of Nazirus, and Rabbi Yehuda said no, it was only 14. That was our Mishnah, Mishnah number 3 that we read yesterday. Here's the Gemara. The first clause of the Mishnah teaches that Beis Shammai say he must be a Nazir for 30 days, right? If he observed his Nazirus outside of Israel, now he comes to Israel and he needs to observe a 30-day term. And Beis Hillel say he is a Nazir from the beginning, meaning he has to repeat the entire term of his Nazirus. Whatever he vowed, he has to observe all of that inside the land of Israel. So the Gemara suggests a possible explanation for the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Let us say that these schools disagree about this, that Beis Shammai hold that when the sages declared that the land of the nations, meaning all the lands outside of Israel, when the sages declared that all the lands outside of Israel are impure, right? That we don't know where bodies are buried in lands outside of Israel because no one cares, right? There's no concept for a non-Jew to become tamei, right? That only applies to Jews. And so no one would care to mark every place where a body may have been buried because of the possibility that a person will walk over it and become tamei by a corpse. So since those land and all the other lands outside of Israel, there are graves that may not be marked and made public knowledge that a person is buried there. So the sages declared that wherever you are outside the land of Israel, you might be walking over a grave, and so all of it is considered tamei. Right, so Beis Shammai hold that when the sages declared that the land of the nations outside of Eretz Yisrael is impure, they decreed so with regard to its earth. In other words, they decreed that only the earth of the land of the nations is impure, meaning if you're walking on the ground anywhere outside of Israel, you're considered to be tamei. You have contracted tumah. But if you simply cross the airspace above the ground outside the lands of Israel, the sages did not decree that more severe level of tumah. So if so, it is not a severe level of ritual impurity, and one who observed a vow of Nazirus outside of Eretz Yisrael is not considered to be impure to the extent that he would be required to start his Nazirus entirely anew once entering Eretz Yisrael, that a 30-day term would be sufficient. And Beis Hillel hold, and now we're on the top of page 20a, today's daf is 20, so they decreed with regard to its airspace, and it is a severe level of ritual impurity. So Beis Hillel have said that even the airspace, right, outside the lands of Israel, if you just cross through it, you're going to contract tumah of a corpse. And so this person who observed his entire Nazirus outside of Israel must begin his, whatever he vowed to do. If it was unspecified, it's 30 days anyway. But if he said, I'm going to do a year of Nazirus or 7 years of Nazirus, well, whatever he observed outside of Israel doesn't count for him, and he has to observe the entire term that he vowed for inside the land of Israel, where it's known where all the graves are, so that a person can be certain not to walk over a grave and contract corpse tumah. So Beis Shammai hold that we penalize him with an unspecified term of Nazirus, 30 days, and Beis Hillel hold that when we penalize him, we require him to return to the beginning of his Nazirus, and he must observe the entire Nazirus afresh. Now, the Mishnah taught about this incident involving Queen Helena. An incident occurred with regard to Queen Helena. A dilemma was raised before them. What is the meaning of Rabbi Yehuda's statement? Right? Rabbi Yehuda said she ended up observing 14 years of Nazirus, 7 outside the land, and then repeating it inside the land. And the rabbis of the Mishnah said, no, she did 21 years, 7 outside the land, 7 inside the land, and then she became impure by a corpse at the very end of her 7-year repetition, and then she had to do it again, and that's how she ended up doing 21 years. So what is the meaning of Rabbi Yehuda's statement? Does he hold that the case was one where she became impure in the land of Israel, but after 30 days and not after 7 years? And Rabbi Yehuda spoke in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, who hold that she was required to observe only a further 30 days upon her arrival in Eretz Yisrael. And due to her becoming impure, she had to observe again her original term of Nazirus, right? Once you become impure by a corpse, you have to repeat your entire tally. So maybe what Rabbi Yehuda was saying is that she did her 7 years outside. She comes into the land of Israel. Beis Shammai say, well, you have to owe an additional 30 days so that you've observed an actual term of Nazirus in the land of Israel. Then she becomes impure. It's not that she has to repeat that 30 days. It's that she has to repeat everything of her Nazirus. And that's how she ended up doing 14 years plus 30 days, as it were. According to this view of what Rabbi Yehuda might have been saying, right? So Rabbi Yehuda spoke in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, who hold that she was required to observe only further 30 days, and due to her becoming impure, she had to observe again the entire 7 years that she did outside. And that made 14 years. Or perhaps the case is one where she did not become impure at the end of 7 years in Eretz Yisrael, and he ruled in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel that she had to observe an additional 7 years upon her entry to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. She ascended to Eretz Yisrael, and Beis Hillel instructed her that she should be a Nazir for an additional 7 years, etc. That's what the Mishnah said. And if it enters your mind that Rabbi Yehuda says that the case is one where she became ritually impure after observing 30 days of Nazirus following her arrival to Eretz Yisrael, and he spoke in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, well, if so, why does Rabbi Yehuda say that she was a Nazir for only 14 years? He should have said 14 years and 30 days, as even Beis Shammai obligate her to observe a 30-day period of Nazirus in Eretz Yisrael. So it must be that Rabbi Yehuda holds that she observed 7 additional years in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, and he says that she did not become ritually impure. Like that was an exaggeration. She had to repeat her whole 7-year term, but she didn't actually then become ritually impure at the end of the 7 years and have to do yet another 7 years. So the Gemara adds, and this is also taught in a Baraisa, that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion cannot be established in accordance with Beis Shammai. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer that the verse states, this is the law of the Nazir when the days of its consecration are fulfilled. That's from Numbers 6:13. And the Torah states, when he becomes impure on the day of the completion of his Nazirs, even if it was at the end of a lengthy term, give him the law of an unspecified Nazir, and he must observe a 30-day term. Therefore, she became impure at the end of those 30 days that Beis Shammai obligated her to observe. She should have been required to observe the Naziris for only 30 more days, rather than a full 7 years. So rather, Rabbi Yehuda certainly accepts the opinion of Beis Hillel and claims that she did not become ritually impure. And indeed, that is a conclusive proof of what Rabbi Yehuda's opinion was. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Here's Mishnah number 4, the final Mishnah of chapter 3. Mishnah number 4. In a case of one who had 2 sets of witnesses testifying about him that he had taken a vow of Nazirus for a certain period, and these witnesses testify that he took a vow of Nazirus for 2 terms, like twice 30 days. And these other witnesses testify that he took a vow of Nazirus for 5 terms, 5 times 30 days. So Beis Shammai say the testimony is divided, i.e. the testimonies contradict each other. And since the testimonies are in conflict, they are both rejected entirely. And there is no Nazirus here at all. And Beis Hillel say, no. The testimonies are not completely in conflict with each other, as both sets of witnesses agree that there was at least 2 terms, right? If one set of witnesses said, this guy vowed to be a Nazir for 2 consecutive terms, and the other one said for 5 consecutive terms, well, then they all agree that he vowed at least 2 consecutive terms, and he's going to be held to be a Nazir for twice 30 days, and that is the law. Here's the Gemara. The Gemara comments, the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of this Tana, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Barakah, says, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel did not disagree with regard to the law in the case of 2 sets of witnesses, one of whom says 2 terms and one of whom says 5 terms, that 2 terms are included in the 5 terms, and he must observe 2 terms of Nazirus. With regard to what did they disagree? They disagreed with regard to one set of 2 witnesses. one of whom says 2 terms and one of whom says 5 terms. And that Beis Shammai say in that case, their testimony is divided. Remember, no matter is ever established by the testimony of one witness, with one exception, basically. There's a couple other things, but basically, where do we accept the testimony of a single witness? Only to allow a woman to avoid the fate of an aguna, a stranded wife, right? So if a woman's husband went overseas, like especially to go fight in a war, and there was only one witness that saw that her husband died, right? So we will allow her to remarry, although she's taking a risk that if the husband turns out to have been alive and he comes back, then her second marriage is null and void. Her first marriage is going to be null and void. If she had children with the second husband, they're going to be considered mamzers, right? Mamzerim. So she takes a big risk. But since it happened all the time that people disappeared or people died in war and there was only a single witness, and if and she's going to take the risk on herself, but she's going to be very careful that that's a reliable, true, trustworthy witness before she does that. All other matters in which testimony could be received in a beis din, in a rabbinic court, the matter is only established by the testimony of 2 witnesses. So here we have the case of there's 4 witnesses. 2 sets of 2 witnesses that contradict each other. And there we say if one set says 2 terms of Nazirus, one set says 5 terms of Nazirus, we're going to say, well, they both agree. All the witnesses agree that there's at least 2 terms, so this person became a Nazir for 2 terms. But what if there are only 2 witnesses? And those 2 witnesses contradict each other? Are we going to still say, well, the 2 witnesses agree that there was at least 2 terms of Nazirus, and therefore this person becomes a Nazir for 2 terms? Or are we going to say that, we've got only 2 witnesses and their testimony doesn't agree with each other, that no Nazirus is established at all because the testimony of the only 2 witnesses that we have is divided? So they disagree with regard to one set of 2 witnesses, one of whom says 2 terms and the other says 5 terms, and that Beis Shammai say in that case their testimony is divided as 2 witnesses are in conflict and there is no testimony at all. And Beis Hillel say, well, since 2 terms are included in 5 terms and both of these witnesses agree that there's at least 2 terms, this man has to become a Nazir for 2 terms. Now, in relation to the explanation that the dispute is with regard to a single pair of witnesses, Rav said, all concede in a case of counting that the testimonies contradict each other. And Rav Chama said to Rav Chisda, what is he saying? What do you mean counting? What does that mean? If we say that he was referring to a case where one witness says he vowed 5 terms and not 2 terms, and the other one says he vowed 2 terms and not 5 terms, in such a situation, they clearly contradict one another and neither of the testimonies is reliable. This person is not established as a Nazir. Rather, Rav is speaking of one witness who says that he heard the person in question count out only 1 and 2 terms when he took a vow of Nazirus, and one says that he heard the person in question count out only 3, 4, and 5 terms when he took a vow of Nazirus. And the Gemara asks, why do I need for Rav to state this at all, now that it is already said with regard to a stringent case where there were 2 sets of witnesses who generally have full credibility, yet Rav said in that the testimony is considered divided with regard to a lenient case involving a conflict with one pair of witnesses who cannot each obligate him in Nazirus? Would he not say that a conflict in their testimony causes it to be disregarded? Of course the testimonies are disregarded if the conflict is within the same set of witnesses. And they say in the West, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to Babylonia, there is no conflicting testimony in a case of counting, as since one of them counted a smaller number and the second counted a larger number, and the smaller number is included in the larger number, there is no conflict, and that's why it ends up being 2 terms. And that concludes chapter 3. Now, before we leave this, you might be thinking, what's going on here? Like this person who vowed Nazirus, all along, we've just been assuming that if you take this vow, you're wondering whether you are held to the vow and you've gone and consulted a halakhic authority. What's this business of witnesses? Why are we bringing witnesses into it? We're talking about like a person took on the vow himself and then he's like, forget it. Forget I said that, right? And truthfully, the whole concept of becoming a Nazir is because a person wants to elevate himself and hold himself to this higher level of sanctity, which is unnecessary and discouraged, but okay, he's doing it. Why do we suddenly have to bring witnesses into it? Because it could be that he spoke in a time of emotion, then he just wanted to, disregard it. But he said it in front of witnesses, and remember, when do witnesses matter? They matter when they say to a person, no, you did that. If you do this, you're going to be held to it. And then if you transgress, you're going to be held to it and you're going to receive lashes, right? And then the guy does it after the warning and in front of witnesses. So, since a term of Nazirus, a vow of Nazirus is established by written Torah law, if you then violate your vow, you are subject to lashes. If you receive the warning before you violated the vow, and you violated immediately after receiving the warning, and it was in front of witnesses. So that's where witnesses come to bear in such a situation. We move on to chapter 4, and we're just going to read the Mishna, and then we'll be done for today, because it's a nice short daf, and we'll continue with the Gemara of this first Mishnah of chapter 4 tomorrow. So after I read the Mishnah, I'll take a few comments and questions. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4. And chapter 4, by the way, is going to have a bunch of, sort of miscellaneous laws of Nazirus. Many of them, what they share in common is that women are involved, right? And we already saw in the case of Queen Helena, that a woman can become a Nazir, and it also becomes an interesting case in terms of interesting legal questions for the sages, because unlike a man, a woman, if she's married or she's a minor living in her father's house, even a vow of Nazirus, a vow by Torah law, can be nullified by the husband or father on the day that he hears of it. Remember, that's a leniency for her. She doesn't have to go to a halakhic authority to get her vow nullified. Her husband or her father can do that for her. A man does not have that option. And here we're going to look at the case of where husbands and wives join their vows together. And since they're bound by different laws because of this aspect of nullification, we'll see that this produces interesting outcomes. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4 on page 20b. With regard to one who said, I am hereby a Nazir. Right? That person just became a Nazir and he didn't specify for how long, so his term is 30 days. One who said, I'm hereby a Nazir, and another person heard him speak this vow, and the second person said, and I. And then a third person heard the two of them speaking, and he added, and I. Right? So one made the vow, the next person said, and I, and then a third person said, and I. So in this case, all of them are Nazirim. They all became a Nazir. So if the vow of the first was dissolved by a halakhic authority, right? The one who made the first vow said, this was a terrible idea. And he went to consult his local Orthodox rabbi and he explained that if he had known what Nazirus entailed, he never would have spoken the vow. And the rabbi nullifies the vow for him. Then what about the other two guys who said, and I, after this first person spoke his vow? What happens to them? So they're all Nazirim, right, who, the first guy and then the two that said, and I. And if the vow of the first person was dissolved by a halakhic authority, then they are all dissolved. The and I creates a vow, but that vow remains linked to the first guy. So if the first guy's vow is dissolved, so is the second guy's, and so is the third guy. However, if the vow of the last individual was dissolved by a halakhic authority, the vow of the last individual alone is dissolved, right? So I say, I am hereby a Nazir, Bli Neder, and then the next guy says, and I, and then the third guy, and I. And then the third guy says, what am I doing? I don't want to be a Nazir. So he runs to a rabbi and says, I said and I, and I became a Nazir, but I really didn't want to. I didn't mean to. I never would have done it if I knew what it entailed. And the rabbi dissolves his vow. His vow alone is dissolved. But the second guy who said and I, and the first guy who spoke the original vow, their vows remain in place. If someone said, I am hereby a Nazir, and another person heard and said, my mouth is like his mouth, and my hair is like his hair, that formula makes the second person a Nazir, just like the first. If a person said, I am hereby a Nazir, and his wife heard him And she said, and I. He can nullify her vow of Nazirus if he so chooses. But his vow remains intact, as his Nazirus is not dependent on hers. However, if the wife said, I am hereby a Nazir, and her husband heard that, and then he said, and I, he cannot nullify her vow of Nazirus because his vow is the second vow. It's dependent on the first vow. And even though he can normally dissolve his wife's vows for her, now that his own vow is dependent on her vow, and a person can never nullify his own vow. So since nullifying her vow would nullify his secondary vow, the dependent vow, now he loses the ability to nullify her vow. She can go to a halakhic authority and have her vow nullified, and if the rabbi nullifies her vow, then the husband's vow would be nullified as well because it was dependent on her who vowed first. However, if the man said to his wife, I am hereby a Nazir, and you shall become a Nazir as well. Now, can you vow for someone else? No, you can't. However, she ratified that statement. He says, I am hereby a Nazir, and you shall be a Nazir too. And she said, Amen. So she's accepting this statement. So now he can nullify her vow because his vow remains intact. His vow was first. Her vow is dependent on him. He can nullify his wife's vow because it doesn't uproot his own vow. However, if the wife said, I am hereby a Nazir, and you are also to the husband, and he said, Amen, right? Now her vow was first. His vow came second and is the dependent one. He can't nullify her vow because the effect would be to nullify his own vow, and a person cannot nullify his own vow. And that concludes Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4, and that's where we're going to stop, and I'll take a couple comments and questions. On Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4, while my document is loading, where Nina passes me the questions. Here we go. Tom, if someone takes such a vow today, what's the outcome? Like, if you can't take a vow Nazirus now, right? Because there's no temple standing in which to bring the offerings that you have to bring at the conclusion of Nazirus. Nor if you become impure, and you're assumed to be impure. In fact, if you take such a vow today when all the graves are not marked, then it's like you're standing in a cemetery, right? What happens? Well, we learn that if you're standing in a cemetery, the vow is real, right? But you can't start counting days until you leave the cemetery, and it's like you can never leave the cemetery, but you still be bound by the vow. Right? As we learned, if you take the vow while standing in the cemetery, you can't start counting days, but you become immediately prohibited to drink wine. So what is such a vow? If a person actually takes on a vow of Nazirus now, I mean, I don't know what the exact halachic device for this is. It's definitely prohibited to take such a vow. But if you do it anyway, do we say that we live in a time without a temple, and so this vow is rendered completely ineffective, as if you never said anything at all? Or do we say, well, he said it, but it is automatically nullified immediately, which is different than like it's like he said nothing. Rather, we say, well, he said it, but then it's nullified for him automatically. Or do we say that you enter some kind of netherworld? I don't know the law offhand. I think we're going to encounter it later in the text. Tom, how could you pass over the earth in those days? Well, I mean, for one thing, you could just be in a stagecoach. You could be carried over, right? You could be carried over. It could be a sedan chair. You could be carried over the earth. So not that impossible. You could also be launched from a catapult. It's funny, like the sages came up with all kinds of unbelievable hypothetical cases. They're like, why would they be asking that? And what's amazing is that so many of those cases actually end up becoming important for modern cases where the sages could never have conceived that the technology that would be available today, and yet they considered cases that have some bearing on it. For example, we were just discussing this morning in my rabbi's class What about, what kind of Jewish laws, halakhic laws are in play when a couple is not able to conceive children and they hire a surrogate mother? Who exactly is the mother, right? Is it the one who provides the embryo, or the one, inside of whom it gestates? And what about a uterine transplant? All kinds of questions that the sages never could have imagined, because that was just not conceivable back then. However, interestingly enough, there is a Gemara, I think in Tractate Sota, where they imagine what would happen. Maybe it's not in Sota, I forget, or Chulin, I forget which tractate it's in. But imagine that a fetus of an animal somehow passed directly from the uterus of like, say, a cow, from one cow to another, right? Without going through the birth canal. Somehow this fetus, they don't talk about a transplant, but somehow there was a connection made between two animals, and the fetus sort of passed through the side of the animal from one uterus into the other, and then was born from the second animal. And so the question then is it a bechor? Right, like if a bechor is the firstborn male animal of any kosher animal. Right, so whether it's a cow or a sheep or a goat, a bechor is consecrated. The first, if the first offspring of the animal is male, then when it comes out, it's a bechor. Okay, well, did the first animal whose fetus left the uterus and went into the uterus of a separate animal, did the first animal produce a bechor? Probably not. But the fact, and I'm not even talking about the outcomes of these questions, what's amazing is that they were talking about such a question. There was no uterine transplant. There was no surrogate mother. There was no concept like that 2,000 years ago. And yet they said, well, what if, and now 2,000 years later, that kind of legal ruling is very instrumental in figuring out what is the law for these modern technological questions. And finally, Lucy, maybe in a chariot, then you're not touching the earth. I mean, I think that's right. That's airspace, is basically you're traveling over the ground without touching the ground. And we'll get into, that question about airspace. We talked about it quite a bit, actually, in Tractate Shabbos and Eruvin, where when you're transferring something from a private domain to a public domain and you throw it, right? And I think they even talked about throwing a person, and if a person is thrown from one to the other or thrown through a domain, right? Passing from a private domain to a private domain, but over a public domain, did you actually were you in the public domain at all if you just traversed its airspace? Those kinds of questions came up in that context. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Please, and I'm going to try to do a double daf tomorrow because Tuesday night there won't be class. Nina and I have a conflict. We're going to an event here in the LA Jewish community. That's what I've got for us. Have a great night.